everybody, and welcome to episode 3 of the Level Up Corner podcast. I am Travis McCollum, and with me again are...
Kyle Carter, aka Wizo, a professional DM and a writer of too many articles on levelupcorner.com.
And Sherry, just a regular person. Hi.
Well, you are a doctor, so...
Just
you do have a doctorate in
doctor.
psychology.
PhD.
So.
Oh, yes.
Yeah,
Yes,
I was about to say...
psychology.
I was about to say, you can't not flex that PhD in psychology, because psychology is a major part of D&D. So
No, it's just her humble brag.
I guess. Yeah,
Well,
I'm not going to be an ass about it.
No,
we
aren't going to be an ass.
Yes, I'm Dr. Sherry Krzaniak, but you can call me Dr. Krzaniak.
Okay. Well, I mean, I'm a professional writer, and there's only so much you can do with that. So.
Let's get into the
But
episode.
What? You okay, Kyle?
But
Yep.
but last episode we were talking about
podcast.
I know. Well, we're all professionals here, so that's how it goes.
Professional goons.
In our last episode, we were talking about how to get somebody into D&D and sort of our pet peeves and things that bothered us. And one thing that kind of got brought up, but as we were sitting here thinking off camera, we were talking about how it could be its own episode, is combat. Combat is, for a lot of people, the most important thing in D&D. For some people, it's the role-playing side of things, and I think there are a lot of aspects where role-playing and combat can go hand in hand. But I'm going to just start with the most general question, and then we can go from there, is how important is combat, do you think, in D&D? Like, how important it is when you're balancing it out, when you're creating a game or you're playing a game, how important is combat to you while you're in a D&D session? Kyle, I'll start
Are we
with
looking
you.
at this on a scale from 1 to 5?
No, I mean, you can go on a scale side of things, but I think, realistically, there are people who will only play D&D for the combat and then never role play. And then there are people who love role playing and don't really want to do combat because they don't really understand all the nuances of combat. But then you have people here with, 3 varying levels of experience. And, I'm somebody who enjoys a good boss battle, who enjoys a good fight here and there, but I feel like I flourish more in the role-playing side of things, so I feel like a nice balance there is good. But I think for other people, they may want more of a combat-heavy scenario, just depending on which kind of layout they're using. So that's why I'm asking kind of the general question of, how important is combat to you when you're going into a D&D campaign? Do you want a lot of combat? Do you want more role-playing? How do you guys want to balance it out? So Kyle, I will start with you since, you're on the DM side of things.
As I already stated, 50-50, about half and half. The reason being is that, strangely enough, for the old guard players, the people who used to play way back in the past of 5 years and further than that, more than any fingers on my hands, there was primarily just combat. Combat existed. Yeah, there was this theoretical thing called roleplay, but it wasn't encouraged as much. Not until at least Critical Role, or actually I'd say more 5e came around, that roleplay was more generally encouraged because the system itself pushed it forward. So for the older people, for the people who have played before 5th edition, combat is extremely important. They'd want like 75% plus of their sessions worth of combat, while the newer players, like you, Travis, and Sherry, are more along the lines of, I like roleplay, and I'd like for the whole thing to be roleplay, or 75% to be roleplay. Sometimes. And it's a good mix in between, because combat has its place. It doesn't need to be a supplement for content and what you do as a DM, although it does take up a lot of time, which is really nice for prepping. But that's why I say it's 50-50 because of the crowd that you're serving, but it does depend upon you as a DM, your play style, and your group.
And what about you, Sherry? What do you think when you go into a campaign? And are you hoping more for role playing? Are you hoping more for combat? Or do you like a nice balance of the two?
Well, it depends on the combat. I typically like more of a balance, but if I had to have a preference, it would be for roleplay, just because I think that's more fun. but I also think roleplay can be more intimidating for players. So in that way, maybe combat would be more preferred. But in terms of like combat being important, I actually think combat is extremely important to do well, because if it's done poorly, I don't really want to be in
that
that
can
game.
kill a campaign. Yeah, it can kill a campaign.
Yeah, exactly.
Random encounters.
Yeah, so while I might have more of a
Although I will say, Kyle, as somebody who is a layman, what now? This could be a very long answer, so try to think of a kind of truncated version of it a bit.
no 15-minute monologue, Kyle.
Condense it.
What did 5e do to really change the way that people kind of focused less on combat and more on roleplay? Because I'm somebody who doesn't really know any of the editions of D&D. I think I did 3.5 at one point, but most of the time, if I've ever played D&D, it's been in 5e. So I don't know a lot about the before times. So what is it that happened in 5e that really kind of changed the structure of something just from really combat heavy to something that was more of a mix? Or is there even a simple answer?
That's a great question.
There is. I could monologue about this for an hour, but to condense it...
Please don't.
Yeah. I know
Please
my
don't
speech
condense
sucks,
it.
so please don't condense it, alright.
No, please do. Please do.
The first point of... the first reason why is because Critical Role became popular. People saw Critical Role and saw that they role-played. And roleplay had always been a part of it, but it was never the main focal point. That's just a quick version as to what Critical Role had to do with the roleplay section. As for the system itself, what 5e did is that, one, I made a joke, random encounters. There are far less random encounters in 5e. Yeah, they're there, but random encounters are since you guys have not had the joys of this. Oh, you guys are moving somewhere. Let me roll a d8. You face a random encounter this hour. Alright, you have 10 more hours to get there. Oh, look, 3 more encounters, so 3 more pointless combats. They didn't have a actual roll. They do exist somewhat in a few different adventure modules, but really it's lessened, and people are not using random encounters as much, and that was the main filler. People just had combat to combat, and if you look at first edition dungeons, it was one room combat, next room combat, third room combat, 20th room combat, all in a row is where some of them went. The Lost City, I think, had the end section of it, just the build of the climax was combat, but for games here, they have a point. There is roleplay that leads to it, and fights are a culmination of what you've been working towards rather than just constant, this is the game, yeah. And that brings us to the third point. In the adventure modules, there was more of a focus upon role-playing. And when people were introduced into the game, there was more role-playing elements that were involved that people had to consider. And the last one is that the system itself had more roleplay elements. For example, you had inspiration, which was for good roleplay. You had skill checks, which were a lot more important. You had skills built into classes much more. Like, yeah, skills exist in 3.5, but they were there, not that big of a deal as they are in 5th edition, though. And it's just I'm bastardizing this, but these are the 4 key points that I think that made 5th edition more of a roleplay centric system than the other super combat heavy systems in the past.
Well, I think it is a question worth asking, though, because, we'll eventually get into the topics of, which editions do you prefer? We'll talk kind of more in depth about editions, but, I think from a combat side of it, I don't know a lot of those. So hearing that, even if it is a shortened version of it, it is really interesting because I didn't know about the random encounters, and I didn't know about how I didn't know any of that, and it is interesting the things that kind of can change over time from that, and it kind of makes you wonder, if they ever do a 6th edition, what will change then. But, for now, we're just gonna, without getting into the edition topic here, we're sticking more to the combat side of it. So, we have talked about the balance between combat and role playing, but there is role playing within combat itself. And I think my question then would be, how do you try to, for a DM side of it with Kyle and then a player side of it with Sherry, how do you try to introduce role playing into combat and try to make things your own with your character while you're in the middle of combat? So that would be my next question there. And if you need an example, I'd be more than happy to get one.
No, you're good. I've already stated that combat is more of a culmination now rather than random encounter. So instead of just combat for combat's sake, there is a point to each combat encounter. You are having this fight because it is guarding something greater. This already puts into the roleplay that this area is guarded. This group has a little bit more clout. Maybe they have a monster there, so they have somehow gotten this monster in. It tells a little bit about the group that's there. You could also say that combat is the culmination of an investigation, to where you go and you fight the evil person, or even an anime. It could be like, where you could kind of incorporate these ideals into D&D, is where a fight makes right mentality does kind of persist, where it can be a clash of ideals, to where you think the citizens should be free while the evil guy is like, no, our dystopia is what they really want, and you have a clash to show which idea is strongest. So you can have that roleplay just upon the setup and the premise of what the combat will be, as well as the monsters themselves, as they can dictate about the environment or get some description about the organization. And in combat, you can have so many things happen. You can have a person gain a flavor to their fighting style. So for example, let's say that this fighter is a halfling, and or this fighter is a goblin, or whatever race has a bonus action to hide, and they always hide and fight, and then you can joke about how they're a rogue and it builds upon their character. You could joke about the time that the fireball almost scorched and killed everyone because it did hit everyone because he didn't pay attention. There's a lot of cool roleplay elements that can be added in, and monsters can be characterized so well. In fact, goblins, I love it. People love my goblins because when they start being in combat, giving the monsters voices are huge. Like, for example, you miss a goblin, say, "Oh no, you missed me! That's because I'm better than you! Ha ha!" As they try to stab and they miss, and they say, "That was a joke! Ha ha! Faint!" And that gives goblins their own personification and personality. So you can do a lot.
Even in and this isn't even D&D. This was in the Star Wars role-playing game that we're doing a campaign with. We had these two invisible soldiers. Like our group, we are like a Jedi in training and a Jawa, and we're all these like people with a lot of powers and a lot of weaponry. We're gonna take on two people in a tower, and yet they were able to take us. They were able to take us all out. Not TPK us, but enough to where we retreated. And it's two people, a technician and a stormtrooper, and giving the voices to them and giving them the character. It was just a battle, but there was a lot of role playing and story within the battle itself. Whether it's dragging off a character after his arm is blown off, but he won't retreat because he's too proud, so you knock him out and throw him over your shoulder and drag him off, or whether, going back to D&D, there was Kai with the brick that ended up critting half of the time. So, there are ways to put in role-playing within it, and it is fascinating how you incorporate it. And Sherry, you're more of a magic user when you do it. So how would you incorporate role-playing when you're doing combat?
Well, I think just in the terms of how different characters handle combat can very much come down to the type of character that you are. So I always think of when you put two different people into a situation, those two different people, based on their personality and their characteristics and their knowledge about the world and just their preferences, they're going to respond to that situation differently, right? So as a magic caster, through my character, I might decide how to handle a combat situation differently than somebody else. So maybe I'm playing more of kind of an introverted, thoughtful, maybe even a bit of a pacifist kind of wizard character. So I'm not going to come out guns blazing with all of these heavy-hitting spells. I might kind of think about battlefield scenarios, or how to set something up on the field, or how to CC an enemy, or how to help an ally, something like that. And you might have, on the flip side, you might have a sorcerer who comes in and they're super extroverted and fiery, and all they want to do is throw fireballs. So, I mean, that in and of itself is kind of like role-playing through combat. And I don't think this just applies to magic casters. I mean, you can definitely do this with like fighting characters as well. If you have kind of a sneaky rogue, that's going to affect how you play in combat.
Or if you or
upfront fighter or paladin, right?
Yeah, you have a paladin who has, they have lay on hands or shield of faith, or you have, a ranger with their bow kind of off to the side, or their animal companion, or what have you. But, that does get into the interesting topic of how classes come into play when you're going into a combat scenario, because we talked about it briefly in our first episode, how it is important to have a support character or a healing person in your party, and how it's important to have kind of a strong fighter type character, a warrior, a barbarian, some sort of fighter, monk, rogue, some sort of character like that. And it is important to have spellcasters as well, and it is a balancing act. And you had talked briefly before about how when you were coming up with characters that you wanted to look at kind of the outline of the party, and then look and see, okay, well, we have this kind of character, this kind of character, and this kind of character. Well, I want to do this. And then for some people, they just kind of do whatever, and then they kind of build up around it. But I have noticed that finding that structure and finding that balance, it is a tightrope, and trying to figure that out, because every character is different, and every character handles differently, because then you get into the race side of things. And I think, this is for both of you, which classes do you think really stand out to you when you're trying to incorporate a party together and you're trying to create something, not only for the player side of things, but on the DM side of things? I know you brought up how, you've created campaigns where there haven't been any healers, and so you just kind of adjusted combat that way. You adjusted combat in the sense where, if you have somebody like a sorcerer and a warlock and, a bard, if it's like a more magic heavy party versus a more physical heavy party, So this is for both of you. Which classes do you think really stand out when you're going into a combat scenario, and how important is that when you're crafting a party?
Martial classes.
Well, probably the classes that would be better at combat would stand out, right? But that's also going to come down to subclass.
Yeah, I would say martial classes are what I consider the most, because martial classes are by far the most impactful on combat. Unless you get that once in a blue moon, I polymorph the bad guy and we can move past them. Oh, great job! Well,
okay, well, yeah.
Yeah, that sometimes magic users just pull stuff like that and it happens. But when you design a combat, primarily you look at martial classes. Why? Magic classes, yeah, they're support, they can do things, but they're not the damage. They're not the ones who are going to finish the combat. They're not going to be the ones who mostly tank stuff. You have to look at the AC comparatives. You have to look at the damage they deal. At level 5, the increase in damage they get, which spikes drastically. Same with possibly level 11, because that's when some features or extra attacks or other things come into play as well, or around that time. But martial classes are by far more impactful than spellcasting classes until probably, I'd say, 7th or 9th level. But even then, you'd still more so balance around martial classes, because those are the core of any party composition.
Sherry, I'm seeing some raised eyebrows, so you go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, magic casters can deal a heck of a lot of damage. They might not have the ability to do that constantly, like with a melee class where they do consistent damage, and it doesn't matter if you're resting or not. But to not take into account what a magic caster can do, I mean, they could blow up your entire scenario very easily with the right spell. They could. I mean, they do have the capacity sometimes to one-shot bosses.
So
I've seen it happen.
This is something a little bit different. This is resource management that you have to take into account when designing how many encounters, what's going on throughout the day. And a lot of 5e that I have found from many DMs is that it was intended with the idea from the previous editions that you would go through the day and have a few separate encounters. By the very end, maybe have a few short rests, be trained, and then you're good. But a lot of 5e games have primarily been one combat per day, bam, which is why warlocks are kind of viewed as less strong
Broken.
because they are. But if you spread out
Well,
combat,
yeah, I guess they're not broken. It's just Eldritch Blast. My mistake.
yeah, but
and then you get into the idea of cantrips versus spells too, because cantrips
Right, yeah.
kind of throw things on their head too.
Well, yes. So martial classes actually are able to burst, especially fighters, are able to burst far more than any spellcasters up to level 7 or 9. The reason being is because Action Surge is so strong. You add that in with their stats, their magical items, heaven forbid you give them extra damage on their weapon, and then yes, they consistently hit more, they consistently do more, and you can have an encounter that has a spread of many different minions, which makes, fireballs and AoEs more practical, giving a bone to the spellcasters there. But primarily when you come to raw damage throughout a combat, if you've ever recorded it, rogues and fighters deal the most, hands down. No competition. No spellcaster has a chance. And this actually does go.
But how long are the combats?
What?
I would think that the length of the combat would make a difference here.
Yeah, the length of the combat and the assurance that this is the only combat. See, spellcasters also have the resources in the back of their mind that, oh man, it's kind of like if you've ever played an RPG, like let's say Skyrim, and you have 98 health potions. You're like, man, I only have 98 health potions. I don't.
Well, that's
dead.
a different. That's
I shouldn't use it. Well,
problem.
it's still in the back of the spellcasters' minds where they don't want to spend their resources right away.
What if it's like a difficult fight and they're going to have to spend the resources if they want to live? Let's just assume all things equal, everyone is doing their best.
If everyone is doing their best, the martial class is still far and in between deal the most damage. The reason being is because spell casting is most impactful when it is not damage. I'll repeat that.
So you're saying support classes then, like people that are healing or support.
Debuffs or buffs are much stronger for spell casting than damages. Pound for pound, they work out more. For example, let's say Bless. Let's compare Bless to, let's say, Magic Missile or Guiding Bolt. Guiding Bolt, you did 46. That's great. You give advantage to the next attack. You roll between 4 and 24 damage. Bless lasts for a minute and gives you an extra 5 to 20% chance to hit. That's huge. Every miss that you turn into a hit is damage you deal. And if you turn 3 misses into hits, you've already done more than Guiding Bolt. You apply that to 3 individuals. Let's say you apply that to 3 martial classes. Those 3 martial classes will assuredly miss once within 5 rounds. Most likely, there's going to be a miss that you could turn into a hit. If you did that for just 3, you gained your mileage. If you do that for even more than that, which I've seen Bless give like 10 hits in 6 rounds, it's been ridiculous, then you will get far more mileage for that one spell, that one Bless, than you would from like Guiding Bolt or anything else. Although it's cool to deal the big burst numbers, it's not as impactful.
Well, and the nice thing about support spells is that they are almost assuredly going to be effective. Whereas a damaging spell, they have the chance to be resistant to it, be immune to it. Maybe they make their saving throw and they're not even affected by it. So then you've completely burned a spell for no reason.
Yep.
And that's always so frustrating as a magic caster.
And
yeah.
And we can go about this with every level. Like, for example, 2nd level hold person. If the enemy fails that save, then everyone goes within 5 feet, auto crits, gets advantage to hits for sure in that round, and even if it only lasts for 1 round, it's better than a fireball, hands down. Better than a fireball, possibly even better than disintegrate, because you're giving everyone auto crits and advantage, which is insane. So
Yeah, and you could also take partial credit for the damage that they do.
yeah, and that's
Because
you adding damage. That's why I'm saying damage itself is you have to look at your martial classes. Those are the core, because if your
Well, they do
martial
the most
class,
consistent damage, but if a magic caster pulls off one of those big spells, they can do really, really incredible damage. Especially if the fight is short, because they're probably going to have limited resources, like you said. So if they blow everything that they have with the first couple turns, and it works out, well, I think they're going to be your top damage dealer.
if you're attributing damage like that, then yes, it could, but there are also ways to subvert this, which is pretty easy. So, for example, if you're having... This is why boss fights don't work very well, the way that they're designed in 5e. But,
No, you can never plan for everything.
well,
Like-
in 5e, it's just like, oh, you have legendary actions. One boss versus a party is terrible, because let's say that, yeah, they get out of their legendary resistances and that whole person goes off. They're pretty much dead. But now, let's say if they have minions, that whole person goes off, and a minion keeps hitting that spellcaster. Well, now you have to roll concentration checks. Ooh, I see you rolled a 1. Noblesse, no hold person. Gone right
Yeah,
away.
it's so frustrating.
Yeah, there's a lot of balance. Like, spell casting is easier to balance because there are ways to subvert the issues that it presents, rather than just, oh, I do insane damage and I can't be hit very easily, if at all. It's just like, well, all right.
Well, then getting into that, what are some of the biggest mistakes that you see regularly in combat, especially for newer players? What are some things that you kind of generally see when people are first starting out at? You know, when they're first starting playing and they're doing D&D and they're getting into combat, what are some common mistakes you see in combat, and what are some solutions you think to some of these kind of issues that you tend to see when you're going into combat?
Would you like to?
I presume you mean apart from just not knowing your abilities.
Well, I mean, obviously you're getting into, you know, like, not everybody will know what their magic spells are. You know, not everybody will know exactly what
like
their abilities
that's
are.
mistake number one.
I mean, yeah, obviously those
Obvious.
mistakes happen, but you know, you're also getting into, like, some people who don't exactly know how advantage works or disadvantage works or how prone works or how, you know, like, oh, well, you have a main action and a bonus action and you have movement and you have this and you have that. Like, there are a lot of times there's the nuances that you learn over time, but what I'm just saying generally, what are some things that you see when you're seeing combat, some issues that, you know, could be fixed or could be handled, like things that could be changed that, you know, what are some solutions you think to some of these ongoing issues within combat? I mean, this is for both of you, and I mean, this can go on either side of it, either the DM or the player side of things.
Yeah, I'm gonna have to think about that for a second, honestly. Most frequently made combat mistakes. I mean, it's not like rule specific, but I think like with new players, they really struggle to be creative with their spells. I find that spell casting can be so incredibly clutch when you think that, you know, your party's gonna wipe, and it's either you act now and save everybody, or you're all gonna die. You can do it as a spellcaster. You can save everyone if you're intelligent, if you're creative, but new players struggle with that. They just see the spell and they're like, oh, okay, I have to use it in this one specific way. And yes, there's obviously it's written, but you can use it in a creative way, like in a way that nobody thought of. Like, I think back to a previous campaign where we used teleport and we got stuck in a wall. And suddenly we were all dying. And I knew at that moment that I had to do something creative or else we were all going to die. So this was like 3.5, I think. We had a spell called Stone to Flesh. So I cast Stone to Flesh. I cast Stone to Flesh on the wall, and then we hacked our way out of it. So really creative use of a spell, but in a clutch situation, saved the group.
I think sometimes I do sometimes think new players feel like they need to be stringent with what they can and can't do, like what they have to do, what they have to stick with. They feel like they need to be doing something a certain way, and if they're not, then, you know. But it is important to be creative. It is important to, this goes into the role-playing side of things. You have to think about what your character would do in that situation because, the creativity side of things can really save you in certain situations. And, all it takes is thinking about that one spell that you like, oh, wait, I have this thing that this can do that. So I think that is a mistake that I do see from time to time.
Yeah, and I would say along those lines, it would be being hyper-focused on one aspect. Usually that aspect is damage. And this goes for fighters and spellcasters, or martial classes and spellcasting classes, is that they're hyper-focused on how much damage I'm dealing, generally. It could be something else. It could be they're hyper-focused on how everyone is keeping them alive rather than trying to spread out their abilities in the most optimal manner. But it's usually hyper-focus on damage. And for martial classes, this means that you could have horrible positioning. You forget about attacks of opportunity. You get caught into a corner. You get surrounded. You get caught in a blast radius that makes that spellcaster unable to cast that fireball they want, or this AoE, this CC AoE. It's being hyper-focused on one thing. Usually it's damage, but it could be just about anything else. And again, not paying attention to positioning or environment, or just generally being creative.
Yeah.
No,
Oh, sorry.
No, you go ahead. Or not thinking
Just
about.
not thinking about the whole environment or about what other people are doing. So not just what the monsters are doing, but what your teammates are doing, and remembering that you're supposed to be working together with them. So if you can work together to figure out, the right positioning or whatever, or setting something up to where the enemy's now in a corner and now you can blast him with a fireball or whatever it is, you have to work together with your team, and you have to think about the bigger picture and how everything's coming together and not just your role in it.
Yeah, not being on the same page. That's another good point for it, as there's so many times when a player's like, all right, I'm going to go in, I'm going to speak with animals to try to make these wolves our friends. You speak with animals, hey wolves, let's be friends. I don't know. The other player? Arrow to the face.
Oh my gosh, that is so frustrating.
Yeah.
Well, you want people to feel like they're involved, but you also can't hijack something when, you can't just go straight into a combat scenario. You have to sometimes think ahead of them. You got to think ahead of the time. If you see a chandelier or you see a gun sitting somewhere, well, you got Chekhov's gun there, you got the falling chandelier. You got to think ahead to some of these things, these scenarios where these things will be involved. Not everything needs to be solved by punching things. Sometimes you got to be able to think creatively with that. But it does bring up an interesting topic that, I haven't had to deal with. Maybe Sherry, you've had to deal with it. Kyle, I know you've dealt with it. How do you handle TPKs?
Sherry, you
I'm trying
want
to think
to
if I have dealt with one. I'm not sure if I have.
But no, generally, I mean, even if you haven't, how would you, so I know Kyle has had this happen before. And,
Oh, yeah.
And I had this happen back in high school. So it does make me wonder, from both the player and the DM side of things, how do you deal with a situation where you've had a TPK? Do you keep going? Do you start up a whole new campaign?
They raise
No,
and they all keep
do you just re-roll? No, it's a legitimate question. Do you just re-roll and make new characters and start again? This. It's interesting because sometimes the DM you'll get to level 20 and you'll get to the big bad, and you'll if people die, they die, and sometimes campaigns go well, they don't. It can go either way, but that's kind of the culmination of we've been talking about, the culmination of 5e. It's the culmination, the story coming to a head, and if everybody dies, then everybody dies. But then sometimes with inexperienced players or players who get a little bit ahead of themselves or don't want to think ahead or think creatively, you'll run into situations where early on or midway through, they'll get completely wiped. And from the player side of it, from my experience, and I'll go to you, Sherry, as well, even though if you haven't experienced it yourself, but I feel like for me, there's this frustration where you want to keep going and you want to keep playing this game. So, you want to re-roll or you want to do this, but there is that frustration, like especially if it's something where somebody wasn't working together or there wasn't, cooperation or teamwork there. It can be frustrating. But I'm really curious about the DM side of things, where you've written out this whole campaign. You've written out the story. You've written out everything. A band of goblins slits all of their throats. What do you do? How do you handle it? So, Sherry, for you, how would you handle the frustration, or how would you feel in a situation where there's TPK? And Kyle, for you, what do you do on the DM side of it when these things happen?
All right, Sherry, go.
Well, if my character actually died from a TPK, I'll tell you right now, I'd be really, really mad. So, I don't think I'd handle it very well.
But what do you think you would be most mad about? The character dying, the situation it happening? Where do you think the anger would be coming from?
Well, I might blame Kyle because it's probably all his fault.
But logistically, it's.
I'd probably be. I don't know. I don't want to say that I would just blame my party members, but it's probably not something I did. Though? I would hope. So I might think about, okay, so how did we get into the situation? What caused it? If someone just really messed up, yeah, I'd be kind of peeved about that. If it was more just an unbeatable situation where we were overpowered and there was nothing we could do, yeah, maybe I'd be mad at the DM a little bit. But I mean, how do you handle it? Well, you just gotta suck it up, I guess.
Well, I mean, would you want to re-roll and keep going, or would you just go, well, screw it, I'm done? How much of that frustration would fall into the first part of it, and how much would you actually want to keep going? I mean, granted, a lot of it depends on the world and the DM itself, but I mean, how much of... Go ahead, Kyle.
I was going to say, if this helps, Sherry and I did do a game where she tried DMing good old first edition, and I had 6 characters, and it was a TPK. It was very fun playing those characters.
Whoops. I'm sorry.
Yep. At that point, it was yeah, we need to cut it off. It happened, and I do kind of wish that we would play with those characters again. But I understand that was kind of the story that was taken off there. So you could actually state from your experience of you TPKing my party.
I don't remember it.
I consider it meant a lot to you.
No, I didn't have a great experience DMing. That's why I don't DM now. But I'm not surprised that I TPK'd you. I didn't know what I was doing. So I probably gave you something that was way too hard.
Mm-hmm.
Because I doubt it.
But then Kyle, on your side, Kyle, how do you handle things from the DMing side?
So I was actually trying to bring into that from Sherry's perspective, as there are different flavors of it. As a first-time TPK with the DM, your experience is, wait, is this really happening? And then there's panic, and then there's maybe we could just not have that happen, just rewind it. And the rewinding, the rewinding is a very common reaction, and sometimes you can rewind it and it can work and everyone's okay with it, but then you've lost a lot of credibility as a DM, and usually it's better for you to just sever it and let it go. I found after a few different TPKs. Of course, if you TPK during a one-shot, well, it's a one-shot. Everyone expects it. Hey, it's all fun and everything.
That's fun because you're not attached to the characters.
Yep, TPKing into campaign. At the campaign's end, I actually had that happen with a Curse of Strahd game. It was one where if a TPK happens in D&D, the best way for it to happen is for it to be telegraphed that this is a possibility. Your players are very aware that they can all die going into this situation. It's not best to have it when, level 1 goblins kill the whole party. That's not really good. But when you are able to let them know that this is their decision to brave the final fight or brave this deadly fight and potentially lose it all, and they go in and they fall short, whether it's the dice, their tactics, or their preparation, which is lacking, which in this case it was their preparation was lacking, then it's more accepted and they understand it. But if it comes out of the blue, That's not so good. It doesn't happen to me anymore because I'm better at it. But whenever it comes out of the blue, you always revert to that beginning DM of the, wait, is this happening? Panic! And then you go through all the different scenarios. You could try to fudge, but if you try to fudge a TPK, it is so blatantly obvious. Just don't. Just don't. If your players are going to die and there is no possible way that you see for them to win, don't fudge the dice because it's way too obvious. I tried that when I was young and it did not work out.
Oh,
And,
Kyle.
Yeah?
I'm surprised you haven't brought up a tactic that you've used quite often in the games that I've been in, where if a party wipes, oh, actually, you didn't really wipe at all. The bad guys dragged you off their lair, and now you've been captured, and you have to find a way to escape.
See, I was gonna say you could
That's a
some more
cop-out.
tactics on how to deal with it from our article. No, but
Oh gosh.
No, but you can get into that because
Yeah,
I mean, because there are aspects of it where you want to keep the story going, so you'll say in a situation where they would all die, you would just drag them off to the lair to be captured.
Mm-hmm.
But as opposed to like the final battle where if they die, well,
Yep,
Mhm.
exactly.
Is what it is.
And there's different situations where like goblins slit their throats. Well, goblins are there trying to kill them. They
Gobbies
die,
wouldn't do that. Gobbies are adorable.
have you seen Goblin Slayer? I mean,
Well, I know not Goblin Slayer.
Slay
But all
goblins?
goblins are evil. My goblins are the cute adorable. Like, yeah, we wouldn't do
They're,
that.
they're evil cute.
We'd only slit out their eyes and make them suffer. Yeah, like no, goblins are evil cute, exactly. But if it makes sense for them to keep going, then you can. And what I mean by this is, yeah, goblins come and they slice them all up and they die. Okay, goblins are not going to save them. That party is axed. But if they're, let's say, TPK'd by brigands or a dragon or even a demon, something that has recognized their ability, well, they become useful. And would you want to toss away a useful tool, or would you want to utilize it in bondage of some sort? You could make them make a geese. You could make a contract. You could blackmail them. There are so many ways to make these ne'er-do-wells become your tools. And if that ever comes about, then yeah, definitely, you can keep it going. You can tie them up and be like, well, you all were unconscious. You didn't die unless you actually failed your death saves, and yeah, that character's dead. But you didn't actually die. Instead, you're gonna suffer, and make sure that there are consequences to where it's like, maybe death was a better option than what they have for you.
but it does make me wonder then, in a situation like that, where you have people in a situation where they are about to wipe, and you as the DM would then have to decide, whether you want to keep them alive by dragging them off or making a contract, whatever, or how I've seen you introduce somebody's sister or brother before, where it's like, oh yes, here's this person's brother coming in, and they're taking over for that situation, or you have an NPC character come in, or you have something along those lines. But outside of the final battle, where pretty much anything goes, is it a narrative structure thing? Is it a party structure thing? Is it a case-by-case basis? Where do you feel...
Holy narrative.
Holy narrative. It's holy narrative.
You have to ask two questions. One, is it planned? Or two, does it make sense? If you are able to have either one of those answered, like, was it planned for them to lose in this fight? Like, was it kind of scripted that way? And normally those fights are really hard to do correctly. But was it scripted that this person is actually investigating this area? And is it actually something happening in the world that would make sense that they can link back and figure out to it? Then, okay, yeah, you can answer that. Or two, does it make sense for them to live instead of die? Like, if they're facing, again, a beast like a Hydra, and no one's around, they know where all their allies are, they know that they're somewhere else, does it make sense for them to be saved? No, not really. Unless you have something really funny planned. See, that's the third, something funny. would be, let's say another party comes in and the party that's about to get TPK'd is this evil party that's just like, yeah, we sell our own mothers. In fact, I've already sold her. It was a few copper, don't worry. Good deal. Hag's gone. And then when they're all about to die, they're saved by the... I made this group just to counteract one of mine. The sun's radiant. Ho ho, friends. We are here with the light of Palor. And we are here to save you. Glad we are here. Oh, what wonderful companions. And just make it to where they're like, man, I wish we would have died. And then you
That's
push.
That's what I was thinking.
Yeah. Make it so that narratively it either has to really make sense, or I guess a better way of putting it was that death would possibly be a better alternative than the embarrassment or suffering that is going to come forth from this. Consequences are important.
So more often than not, it's narrative based. But I do feel like though, and granted, this is from person to person, but I have seen instances with other DMs where, they get tired of a party, or they get, somebody's really annoying them, or they really feel like the story isn't going anywhere. And there's I'm just saying, but how much of that ever weighs on you when you're thinking about that? I mean, granted, it's always better to go with the narrative out. It's always better to go with the narrative out situation where something like that can happen. But, there will be instances where some DMs will really feel like they don't really, I mean, is the professionalism side of it, or is it the enjoyment side of it, where they have to try to balance it out and try to figure out, do I just wipe this party and move on? Has that ever crossed your mind?
Yeah, Kyle, have you ever purposely tried to kill your party?
Well, and not just that, but for DMs, but for new DMs out there, or people who are less experienced, what would your advice be in situations where the party may be getting annoying, and that little inkling, that little lizard part of your brain is telling you to do that? What would your advice be then in situations like?
So this is the
like that, because you found that about, or a situation.
So this is the core root problem with many bad DM decisions, is that you believe that you cannot talk to your party about what is going on. You have to have a veil of being the master of everything and control of it all, when you're really flying by the seat of your pants like, I'm a newer DM, I don't understand what's going on, I don't really like these people. But instead, what you need to do is just talk to your players and be honest. It's much, much better to tell them like, hey guys, gals, I'm not too interested in this right now. It's just not for me. I'm not feeling well right now. I have a lot of stuff going on in my life. I'm not enjoying the game, and I would like to end it. Or you try to find a narrative note to end it on rather quickly. Better than, oh, everyone dies, because then everyone feels betrayed. They're like, why did you do that? Why did we just all die? This is unsatisfying. This isn't a good conclusion. And you betrayed them. You've burned your bridge as much as you can. Never TPK just when you want to get out of a group. Just no.
So you're saying communication? Communication is the biggest thing. But then on the other side of it too, you have combat where you're not trying to kill them and they all just die, or in a situation where you're going up against the big bad at the end, the big final boss, and everybody dies. How do you, for lack of a better term, prevent disappointment? Prevent feeling like things are just going to end in a wet fart.
I think the best way to prevent disappointment is to give them realistic expectations. So, for example, I would say the best way to describe this would be the Curse of Strahd game, where I had with the party just TPK'd at the very end. They knew that they had to do something. Not going to spoil it if you don't want to play Curse of Strahd, but they knew they had to do something in order to weaken him. They knew that they had to become stronger while also weakening Strahd, the Lord of the Land. they became a little bit stronger, didn't get everything that they needed to, made some decisions to refuse power, so it didn't make them as strong as they could have been, and they didn't weaken Strahd. Now, this was set up 20 sessions plus prior to when they encountered their final fight with Strahd. They knew why they failed, and it was their choices and their decisions which led them here to this failure. So again, just making sure that it's understandable.
What's that, Sherry?
I'm sorry, it's your choices. It's your decisions that led to your own failure.
Ultimately, the DM can't force them to
funny.
be good players, so they can't force them to be
You
good
suck,
players.
you die.
Yeah, and as long as they can look back and say, like, yeah, we screwed up, then it's not a true disappointment. It's that was a good ride. And yeah, we didn't do everything we could have. It makes sense, rather than just...
But I feel that, like, I'm sorry, but no player wants their character to go out in a totally pathetic way, you know?
Well, it's not desirable. You don't want it, but sometimes you just... You didn't do enough, and if you are able to see when the TPK happens and look back to find out where you failed and the continuous failures that were brought upon by your actions that led you to this point, then it softens the blow quite a bit. Of course, you don't want to die, but it's like what happens in many historical figures, especially like Napoleon, where he had some issues in Spain, then eventually he screwed up in Russia, and then just little by little he was chipped away. And it's like, yeah, he didn't want to lose everything, but when you look back on it, you can see where he failed and where the chips started to crumble. You want to have that experience with your players, or let them be able to see it on their own, and not just you all die. So, why did we die? What happened? How did we all die? Oh, just lucky rolls, or oh man, you guys just sucked. It's like, but I don't see how we died. There's no logical reason. It needs to have build up to it, or a chance of it happening. Again, you never want TPKs to happen, but it has to be their own decision, where they can look back and find out where and how it happened.
Well, and I mean, go ahead, Sherry.
I was going to say, maybe a way to lessen the blow would be to kind of emphasize the impact that they had on the game, and maybe with whatever new character they roll, there's some kind of connection there between the impact that the old character had on this new character. So at least the old character didn't die in vain. They still had an important purpose to play, and they were still important in some way, in terms of the bigger landscape of the game. And that continues forward in the new character.
I mean, at the end of the day, if you're going to be paying for a session, you want it to end satisfactory. You don't want to feel like you got chipped in the end.
That's a whole nother layer to it. More pressure.
It is a whole other layer to it. But, I realize we spent quite a bit of time on that. But I feel like it is a topic that, there are multiple layers to it from the DM and the player side of it when you're getting into a situation where people are wiped. But kind of going back more to the general combat aspect of it, how important do you think it is to maintain flow of combat, and what do you think the best way is to maintain that flow of combat and to kind of encourage players to reach that point where combat can be more smooth? Obviously, there will be, if we're newer players, they'll stop and ask questions, but at a certain point, if you've done enough sessions and if you explain things enough, you'll reach that point where things flow. But how do you feel, as a player for Sherry and as a DM for Kyle, like to maintain that flow of combat? How best do you think to maintain it and to facilitate it?
You can go first, Sherry.
Well, I mean, it's absolutely essential. If your combat doesn't flow, well, people aren't going to pay attention. They're going to forget what they're doing. You're going to get to their turn, and they're going to have no idea what's even going on. And it's going to be choppy, and it's going to take way too long. So it's just going to be really bad combat. So if your combat flows, that keeps everybody engaged. And in terms of engagement, as a player, what I try to do is I try to focus on what other people are doing. So I don't go on Facebook for 5 minutes and then come back when it's my turn and then look around and be like, oh, what am I supposed to do? I actually focus on what other people are doing, and I'm kind of planning out my turn as other people are going. If you're a magic caster, it's a little bit harder because a lot can change in an entire round. So what you were going to do at the beginning of your last turn might not be what happens in, after a couple more people have gone. But the same sort of thing applies. Still focus on what other people are doing, kind of start planning, thinking. What I like that Kyle does is that he has music playing in the background. There's tokens on the screen, so there's something visual to look at. So all of that also kind of helps keep you engaged.
Yep, I 100% agree with that. I would also add that flow is not only essential, but when you lose flow, it is a death spiral. Because, I look at my phone and I'm on Facebook. Oh, what? It's my turn? Someone else gets the idea. Oh, that's okay. And then they get on their phone. Oh, what? It's my turn? What's going on? And then this cycle happens where it becomes a slow muck of a drag to where you can't get through anything. And instead of this nice crisp bam, 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 like some of my players have been along the lines like, oh, wow, it's my turn already. Because because players aren't staying on Facebook, they're actually paying attention, and if you don't pay attention, it's just this death spiral. Second, as you were kind of hinting at, Sherry, have a backup plan. Have a few backup plans if you need. Don't just think of one thing. Have different ideas. Hello. Our cat is saying hi. She is very mad that the door is closed. But aside from the cat's point of view, for a DM especially, what you can do to maintain flow: one, don't have so many creatures and tokens. Many multiples are too much. Two, have an average to creatures and tokens for their attacks and damage. Or three, pre-roll. Don't roll on their turns. Roll before the creature's turn. So while, let's say, Sherry and Travis are going, I'm already rolling all my attacks and spells and everything else, so that by the time it's my creature turn, I just give a brief, the creatures do this, alright, next player's turn, and then it goes to them very quickly. Another way to maintain flow of combat is to have an initiative chart. Oh, this was impressive for the huge changes. I never had it before, but then when I got a little whiteboard, what I have my mic on here, and I put my dry eraser on it to get... Putting it back now. This is a bad idea. To get people's names and initiatives onto the chart, people were able to see when their turns were coming up. They were able to tell, like, oh, okay, if I need to address this important text, because sometimes real life comes up, I can see where my turn is. And then when my turn's coming up, I can actually pay attention. So those are a few different ways to maintain the flow of combat, which is essential to make it go from this muck of, oh, why are we in combat again, to this really quick, descriptive, awesome, flowing thing.
Yeah, it is. It's always going to be a mix, but I do find it interesting because you usually use Foundry for your games. You use Forge Foundry. Not entirely sure what the company is exactly called. You always send me a Forge.
Foundry is the VTT, Forge is the server.
Okay.
What does that mean?
So Foundry.
Yeah, actually, go ahead with that first.
Yeah, Foundry is the system we play on. Forge is kind of like the cloud, the Google Docs, which has all the information, or a better way to say it would be like the server where an online game would be stored. So it runs on its internet speed and its memory rather than my computer's internet speed and memory.
Okay.
And, well, I mean, it is interesting, though, because you see a lot of new players, though, and they go to Roll20. Roll20 is obviously the place that a lot of people go to, but you use Foundry. What are some of, from a combat side of things, I know you use Foundry, but like some of the bigger pros and cons of comparing Roll20 to Foundry in terms of combat and how it feels both as a player and a DM when you are, when you're using, because I know Sherry and myself, we both started with Roll20 when we started our first campaign, and then transferred over to Foundry. and me personally, having been on Foundry long enough, I do tend to enjoy that more because of the music aspect of it and certain of the custom plugins that are there, as well as the initiative of like just literally hitting the little punch button and then going from there. But I do think there are some pros and cons between the two of them. But what made you decide to want to ultimately switch over from Roll20 to Foundry, and how do you think that feels combat-wise for both you and Sherry? Because I enjoyed combat on both, but I find myself now, having used Foundry long enough, that I tend to prefer combat that way.
So I want to preface this that I have not used Roll20 really within a year or so.
It's been a while.
It's been a while. And I also want to say that I didn't explore Roll20 as much as I probably could have. However, with that being said, part of the reason is that Foundry was, 1, easier to work with, 2, has more mod support, so if I want something like, I want a cool combat tracker or a little spiral underneath the person whose turn it is to show them, hey, do stuff, then I can get those mods. And really the reason why I switched is because Roll20 had laggy issues, and it had IT issues, and when you switch from well, we already talked about the flow and how if it becomes worse for any reason, whether it's the players or the DM, then it could just spiral out of control. Well, Roll20 is notorious for its IT issues, which also causes a disruption of the flow, which makes combat not as good as it would have been before.
Well, that's why I was bringing up flow, is because that was something I noticed was the lag there. So, Sherry?
I don't remember too much about Roll20. I've actually pulled it up in another tab here just to remind myself of what it even looks like. But, I mean, yeah, we left because of IT problems, but I don't remember having any particular issues with the combat in Roll20. I do really like the combat in, is it Forge or Foundry?
Foundry.
Whichever one.
Something important also with Foundry that I completely forgot. The system has easier macros as well.
Yeah, there might be more on the DM side. I mean, as a player, combat's combat. It's nice if you can put some other stuff in it, like the music or the tokens or, the initiative track or whatever, to make it more engaging. But, I mean, from the player perspective, I'm really just there trying to plan on my turn. I'm not worried about all the intricacies of the IT stuff.
Well, what's interesting to me, though, is I hear a lot about Roll20, but I haven't heard as much about. I had never heard of Forge Foundry until you had brought it up, Kyle. I mean, granted, we can get into this topic in another episode down the line on the online D&D side of things.
One that I've only heard about and am not qualified to talk about every tabletop one, but hey.
Well, no, it is interesting, though, because, why do you think it is that, is it just ease of access that Roll20 has had? Like, Roll20 seems to have a bigger share of the market because...
100%. Roll20 has it's free. It's free, first of all, which is why it is no barrier of entry, much easier for people to go to. And they had a good marketing campaign to where they were one of the earliest ones, and therefore people all know of Roll20. So, of course, Roll20 is going to have that. In addition to it, it also is a very open source type of system to where you could easily apply Starfinder, Pathfinder, you could apply even like Warhammer stuff, and while Foundry needed to wait for all that to be implemented to have a specialized modular system put into it, Roll20 was just, roll and have fun here, and it had more support, and it had just a much better start than everyone else, as well as it being older. That being said, the other ones are more refined, and Roll20 has not dealt with the problems that its growth has caused. For example, it has a lot of server congestion, which has caused problems, which is why we use Forge as our server, so that it doesn't have those congestion issues that Roll20 has, especially if you try to play during prime time. Your IT issues will be tripled, at least.
Well, is it still the case, though, because we haven't used Roll20 in like a year?
Yes. to my knowledge, it still is. It's getting slightly better, but they haven't improved it really in years. They haven't put forth the effort to do so, which is what they need. And they can't...
Well, I don't think we're ever going to get sponsored by Roll20.
Well, no,
This is my
probably
understanding. I could be wrong, but...
probably not. But, you know, I mean, I'm just looking for honesty here because, you know, we were talking about this.
Oh, yeah, you'll get
combat,
that.
and
That's for sure.
Well, and I remember with Roll20 is we were dealing with issues on the server. We were dealing with issues with lagging, and that ultimately kind of took people out of the flow of combat. That was something that absolutely hurt it, and that's why I wanted to bring it up. Obviously, we'll get more into the online D&D side of things and the online DMing. You know, we have episodes up the wazoo for all of that, but within that same region, though, going with the combat side of things is, you know, flow is very important. And if you have a system that helps with flow, that's great. Much like Foundry, you know, much like with that. But, you know, if you have something that's lagging, that can take you out of it because it can, you know, that flow of combat can be really important because, like Kyle said, when you're staring at your phone, you're on Facebook or you're scrolling through Reddit or you're doing whatever, you know, if you're not paying attention to the game, well, it can happen if combat takes, like, to do one round, it takes like a half an hour or it takes 45 minutes.
Oh,
and
gosh,
it
that's
has.
insane.
It has. That's the problem, is things like that have happened and will continue to happen.
To clarify,
Like,
there are people who do not have any issues with Roll20, who do not know what we're talking about, who are like saying that Roll20 has never had a lag issue with me. And for you, I'm glad you've never had this issue. But this is a huge reason why many people have shifted. And again, I haven't paid attention recently to see if they've solved their issues. I've already moved fully to Foundry. Like, my Switch is done. So Roll20 could have gotten a lot better. It could be amazing now. It could be the Wonderland utopia of what VTTs are going to be. But I just want to throw that out there that experiences may differ.
yeah, no, it's different for everybody. But, I mean, now, you know, we've spent about an hour talking about combat, and there is a lot of aspects to combat. But are there, you know, as we start to wind down here, are there any aspects about combat you wish to discuss? Or
Yes,
things
making
that,
combat come alive.
yes, how do you... All right, so we'll make that the last subject for combat here. And we can always explore more combat later as we go down. But for our final topic here, let's talk about how we make combat feel alive. So, when you hear something like that, what are some of the first things that come to mind, and how do you personally feel like you make combat come alive, and what are some tips and tricks that you would say you would have for somebody to make things more livelier?
Description, detail, personalization. Make the players personalize their own spells by describing how their spells work. Give them the option to give detail to their strikes, especially if it's the finishing strike, to make it come alive. And also make your creatures a bit more personalized by giving them voices like we talked about with the goblins and everything else. The last thing you want is, alright, roll the hit. What'd you roll? 13? Miss. Alright, Jim, your turn. 17? Hit? Alright. 5 damage? Cool. Tina, your turn. That is the last thing you want. So, details, description, and personalization.
Mm-hmm. You don't want things to become monotonous. You want things to have life to them.
Indeed.
Sherry?
You know, I would just say don't be afraid to use part of your turn for, I guess you could call it roleplay, but just ways to make combat come alive. I'm playing a rogue right now in our current campaign, and I just think of, well, you know, I don't have to optimize every single part of my turn. I have the acrobatics skill, and soon that's going to be, what's the word? I'm going to be proficient in it very soon. And I mean, acrobatics isn't even a skill that's all that useful, but I'm going to be proficient in it, and I'm a swashbuckler, so I may as well do some fun stuff with it. You know, maybe some flourishes with my sword, or, you know, maybe I might try to somersault over an enemy, or swing from a chandelier, or just something to add some flavor, because the game's supposed to be fun and it's not just all about optimizing every single move you do in combat. So sometimes I try to think, I wonder what my character would do in this particular situation.
Yeah, it's important to look. Yeah, it's important to look at how your character would perceive things, like the comparisons between Kai and Alice. Kai would just kind of rush in things. She'd have her bow, she'd have the brick, she'd have whatever, and she would rush into combat and just kind of rush into things and do things. But as herself, she was kind of more chaotic, not going into the alignment side of things, but just chaotic in general in terms of it was like constant movement and constant action happening. Meanwhile, with Alice, she's more reserved because she is a support character during combat, outside of the occasional poison spray or, Song of Storms or a random, some sort of random hit here and there, or a vicious mockery, hideous laughter. One of the random spell ideas. For the most part, you are playing the support side of things, so you kind of have to think about how you want to use your bardic inspiration if you're going to inspire somebody, or how you're going to play into the character kind of standing more in the background. And every class is different, and some classes will be right out there in front fighting things, and some will be kind of more in the back. But you got to learn how, what would your character in this situation do? And I mean, granted, it's not easy. It's going to be different for everybody. Everybody's going to have different aspects of it, and some people aren't going to be as comfortable with it as others. But just in the back of your head, if you are playing D&D, and regardless of what class you are, whether you are martial or you're not, it just doesn't matter. Whatever you are, just think about what your character would do, because ultimately you're trying to live this life of this character and make them feel alive. And if you make them feel alive, then by extension, combat feels more alive and it feels more engaging, because then it helps with the flow. And if the flow is working and the combat is engaging, then people, won't. The people who are more roleplay heavy will be enjoying combat, and the people who are enjoying combat will be enjoying combat more. So there's multiple aspects to it, and it is really important to put that personalization and put that personal spin on combat when you're going.
Indeed. And to clarify, you don't need to get a new skill for that or anything else. You could even just make a bit more detail, like how do you do bardic inspiration? I go, Sherry. Hey! Finger guns. And that just inspires you so much. And that just makes it stupider, but makes it more fun.
No, but that's what Alice does. She just does the finger guns, and it works.
Yeah, and it's
magic.
Everybody's different, though. Everybody's
stupid,
different,
but it makes it come alive. It's great.
It doesn't have to be profound. It just has to be unique.
Mm-hmm.
And if it's unique,
yeah, but even beyond that, I find that the combat scenarios that I remember the most are the ones that I actually envision in my head. Not just from the perspective of, there's tokens on a board, but no, I'm actually a person in this role, in this scenario, and I can see all of my my party members around me, and there's monsters, and I envision myself going through the actions and actually what's happening around me. That's way more fun. It kind of turns it into a movie situation instead of just
you put yourself in their shoes, and
that's so much fun.
Yeah, those are the encounters you tend to remember, and those are the ones that kind of stick with you more, I think. So, and I think there is a lot of topics to discuss with combat, but I think it was important to we don't want to just stick with one certain thing and just beat that horse to death. We want to, here at the Level Up Corner podcast, we want to be able to talk about different aspects, whether it's getting people into D&D, whether it's about alignment, whether it's about classes, whether it's about combat. Because a lot of times, how often do people think about TPK unless it happens to them? How often do people, how often do people think about certain nuances in combat, or the martial versus magic? How many people do think about the different aspects of combat? Because sometimes combat is just combat, but if you actually take the time to think about it and take your time to put yourself in the shoes of it, it can be really entertaining, even for those that aren't really super deep into combat, or they're more support class. There's still a lot of fun to be had. So I think it's important to talk about combat. And of course, as combat goes on and as time goes on, we can continue to talk about things and bring up topics that we've discussed in the past. But I think for a third episode here, I think this was about as good as we can get with talking about combat right now. And of course, we can discuss this later on. But I think, did either of you have any final thoughts about combat or anything in general regarding combat, or do you think we about covered it for the most part? All right. Well, then, I think with that, yep, keep moving, pay attention, keep the flow going. I think that's about as good as it can get. But I think with that out of the way, you can find all of our social medias at the Level Up Corner on Instagram, Twitter, Facebook, pretty much everywhere. TheLevelUpCorner.com for the articles. You can find the twitch.tv/levelupcorner. You can find the VODs on YouTube. You can find us on YouTube. If you hate our voice, if you hate our faces, you can listen to our voices on Apple Podcasts or Spotify. Give us reviews, however you want to do that. But until then, keep playing role-playing games, keep on playing D&D, and we'll see you all next time. Thank you, everybody.
Bye.
Bye.